Hi, good day everyone. Welcome to our video recorded lessons on fundamentals of accountancy, business and management 1. Today, we are going to discuss on the third step of the accounting cycle, which is posting. Now let us define what posting is. Posting refers to transactions identified and recorded in the general journal sheets and are transferred to the specific accounts in the general ledger and its subsidiary ledger if appropriate. Let us then post the transactions from the general journal to specific accounts in the general ledger. So for our discussion this afternoon, we would be discussing or differentiating the general ledger from the subsidiary ledger from our or through the entries that we made in our general journal. Now take note that this journal sheet is actually made or was actually made through our discussion last week. If you could recall our discussion on journalizing, these are actually our journal entries from last week's discussion. Now, how then we post our journal entries to our ledger? So let's start with general ledger first. Okay, so cash. We all know that cash is debited for 500,000 pesos. That's why in a general ledger, our ledger under cash, account title, and account number 101 should be debited also with 500,000 pesos. So from this journal entry, we actually reflect it in our general ledger under the debit side, which is 500,000 pesos here. Okay? So, accounts payable, credit of 200,000 pesos. Then we also have to post it to the accounts payable ledger of account number 201 on the left side, on the right side rather, which is 200,000 pesos. Okay? The first entry, we have Rodriguez capital of 300,000 pesos, credit, which is 300,000 pesos. Now, on the general ledger, on the Rodriguez capital, we also credit the same amount of 300,000 pesos. Now, take note that in our general ledger, before we proceed with our discussion, by the way, for our ledgers, it's actually, when you talk about general ledgers, these are actually individual accounts. Okay? These are actually individual ledger or individual accounts of our business. So say for example, cash. So we have one ledger for cash, another ledger for computer equipment, another ledger for accounts payable, another ledger for Rodriguez capital, and so on and so forth. Now from our journal entries, since our journal entries actually is the first or the book of original entry, so when we do posting, we actually base our entries in our ledger from our journal. So when we do posting, we actually get the entries in our journal to fit into our different ledgers in the general ledger. So in the ledgers or in the general ledger, we usually have multiple accounts or multiple ledgers. So say for instance, cash, it is under ledger account number 101. By the way, 101 is based on the chart of accounts, okay? So the account number is actually based on the chart of accounts. So when I say ledger 101, this actually refers to cash. When I say ledger 301, this refers to Rodriguez Capital. When I say ledger 134, this refers to the ledger of computer equipment. So that is the very essence of ledger. So usually, when we do posting, we are actually sorting our journal entries from our general journal sheets. Okay? So to move to the next transaction or to the next journal entry, we have computer equipment of 200,000 with a debit here on the journal. So therefore, we should also post this to the computer equipment ledger of 134 on the debit side of 200,000 pesos. Now in making our ledger, we have here date, okay? We have the month and the year. So we have to put there the date and then our explanation. Any short phrase which would actually describe the transaction. The reference number is no longer coming from the chart of accounts but rather on the page of where the journal entry is located. So for instance, if this transaction is located on page 1 of the general journal, then the reference number under the general ledger should be number 1. If this entry perhaps, example only, if this transaction is located on page 2 of the general journal, then ideally the reference number for this one should also be number 2. So, to conclude, The reference number used in our ledgers are based on the page number of our general journals. Okay? So let's move to the third example, third entry. But before we begin to our third entry, we forgot also to post our cash. Our cash credit of 200,000 pesos. Therefore, we also have a credit of 200,000 pesos for the computer purchase. Okay? Next entry is rent expense debit of 10,000, credit 10,000 pesos also for cash. So rent expense account number 502, we have here debit of 10,000 pesos and a credit of cash of 10,000 pesos on the right side of the ledger. Okay? Now to proceed, the fourth journal entry, taxes and licenses expense of 1,500 and credit cash of 1,500. So tax and license expense debit 1,500. So we have here taxes and license expense on the left side 1,500 on April 30, 2020 and a credit of 1,500 on the cash ledger. So here 1,500 payment for permits and licenses. Again, your explanation would actually depend on you. Any phrase will do so long as it describes the transaction. Next, on June 30, our general journal entry is debit cash 32,000 and credit service revenue of 32,000 pesos. So we're actually using here a single entry as discussed from the previous week. So debit cash 32,000 on the left side and then you also post your service revenue to the service revenue ledger number 401 on the right side. Generated revenue of 32,000 pesos. Okay, next journal entry. Debit, utilities expense 55,000, credit 5,500 for cash. So debit, utilities expense on the left side here and credit cash of 5,500 on the right side of the ledger account number 101. And lastly, we have here salaries expense for 8,000 pesos debit and credit cash 8,000 pesos for the last journal entry. So debit, salary expense, we post this to our salary expense ledger number 503. We have here 8,000 pesos on the left side and of course credit of 8,000 for our 101 ledger which is salary or which represents the salary of the internet shop attendant. Now what do we do then to our ledger after all the journal entries have been posted to our ledger? So it's simple. We have to add everything, okay? Or we need to get the net effect of each account under each ledger. So we have to get the running balance or not running balance. Instead, we have to get the ending balance, okay? Ending balance because every month we usually get the balances of our accounts for us to know how much already is the amount or how much is the balance of our account at the end of every period. Usually every month in businesses because we usually pay taxes every month. So ideally we close or not we close but we actually have to compute for the ending balances of our different accounts at the end of the month. So we have here debit side of the cash 500 plus 32 532 and also on the right side rather we have 200 plus 10,000 plus 1,500 plus 5,500 plus 8,000 pesos. Okay, this is our total credit. Now, this credit should be deducted from our debit. So, the net effect actually is 307,000. Therefore, we have a debit balance of 307,000 for our cash. Meaning to say, we started on April 1 with a cash of 500,000. But because of the revenue and the expenses and the purchases, we are able to get an ending balance on June 30 at the end of the month for 307,000. Meaning to say, we have deducted or we were able to make a net effect of around 193,000 for us to get the 307,000 pesos. Okay? So, I hope it's clear that that is the process on how to get your ending balance. It's just simple. Add everything on the left, Add everything on the right. If the normal balance is debit, so of course, you deduct your credit from your debit. If the normal balance is credit, then you deduct your debits from your credits. But since this is a cash, we all know that the normal balance is debit. Therefore, add everything debit and then deduct it by your credits. You get 307,000. You put it here in the debit side because the normal balance of the cash account is debit. If you do not have any other transactions, like example for equipment, for accounts payable, for Rodriguez Capital, service revenue, rent expense, salaries expense, and taxes and license expense, of course, with our utilities expense, then automatically that becomes your ending balance. We need to say during the month, you have incurred, for example, salaries expense, you have incurred on June 30 a salary expense of 8,000 pesos. So you debited salaries expense for 8,000, automatically that becomes your ending balance of 8,000 pesos. At the start of the month, there were no transactions or there was no amount incurred for salaries expense. However, at the end of the month, you paid 8,000 pesos for your employee. That's why the ending balance is 8,000 pesos. So I think that's very easy. The posting is very easy. It's just a matter of posting our journal entries to its corresponding ledger accounts. And take note again that ledger accounts, this is actually maintained, or these are maintained by our business. Usually this is called the book of final entry, because before we prepare our financial statements, we have to you have to put all the journal entries in our ledger for us to be able to come up with our ending balances for a certain period. For this instance, we are getting the ending balance of our business, or one periodic business, at the end of the period from April to June. I hope that we were able to understand how posting is done before we proceed to subsidiary ledger. So I think I was able to explain well on how to do posting. Okay, so how does subsidiary ledger differ from general ledger? Now, if you could recall in our discussion from the previous weeks that a subsidiary ledger actually gives us the running balance of our accounts, or our, say for example, cash account. So for every transaction, there is a running balance. It is actually, it is usually referred to as a statement of account, because when we look at our bank statements, if you could recall, on the credit side and the debit side, at the right side rather of the credit side, we have there the balance. So it's actually running because every transaction there is a reflected balance for that certain transaction until it gets to the it goes to the bottom of the statement. Therefore, the bottom part, or the last balance, is actually the ending balance, and the first balance on top is actually the beginning balance of the certain account. Okay, so sometimes a ledger can also be illustrated through a T account. So usually in my discussion or in my class, I usually use T accounts because the ledger, for the purpose of discussion or for the purpose of illustrating what a general ledger looks like, it's actually the right thing to do. But then we could actually make a possible alternative for or how general ledger is done, or how posting is done. So sometimes a ledger can be illustrated through a T account, such as the following. So we have here our T accounts. When we talk about T accounts, it's actually literally letter T, okay? Literally letter T because it is designed to be letter T. So again, when we post, like for instance, cash, debit, 500,000. So you put here 500,000 on debit side of 500,000 for cash. And then credit accounts payable, 200,000 pesos. So we look for the T account of accounts payable. So we put here on the credit side, 200,000 pesos. And Rodriguez Capital, 300,000 pesos on the credit side. So we put here on the Rodriguez Capital credit 300,000. It's actually the same. However, this is much simple. And for me, this is easier because we would no longer be seeing other parts of the ledger, such as reference number, such as the explanations. Okay, so it's actually more convenient for me whenever I use the account, whenever I post transactions from general journal to the T accounts, because in any way I would still be able to get the same ending balance for the different accounts. So to test whether we have the same balances, for cash, we have 307,000 here. Of course, we have 307,000 here. And then computer equipment, we have 200,000, the same balance, okay? So on and so forth. Again, in any way, we get the same balance before we could proceed to our next step, which is to make our unadjusted trial balance. So the same procedure is done for all or for the rest of the transactions or for the rest of the journal entries in our general journal. So debit computer equipment 200,000. So for computer equipment 20,000 down to our last entry, which is cash credit 8,000. So we could see here in our T account 8,000 pesos on the right side. Okay, so I think that's it for this week. Thank you for streaming our video for today. I hope that you were able to get or to have a better grasp of what posting is all about. See you next week for our next lesson. Have a great day and stay safe.